Hello everyone, welcome back to GraveTales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. I want you to leave a comment on where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get into tonight's stories. Story 1. I took the house-sitting job because it sounded easy and quiet. A much-needed break from the cramped apartment I shared with 2 roommates and their always barking dog. It came through a local referral page online. Nothing sketchy, just a post from a woman named Meredith, who claimed she needed someone to stay in her home for a couple of weeks while she traveled to Oregon to help her sister recover from surgery. The house was outside of town, nestled just beyond the tree line along a quiet country road I'd never noticed before. The photos she posted made it look idyllic. 2 stories, wraparound porch, plenty of space, and best of all, no pets to care for. No plants, even. She mentioned that the house just needed a presence. Someone there to keep things feeling lived in, to collect the mail, to make sure it didn't look abandoned. I'd be paid decently and have full access to the kitchen, Wi-Fi, everything. She said I could treat the house like it was my own. It sounded too good to be true, but we met at a coffee shop beforehand and she seemed completely normal. Older than I expected, maybe late 50s, with streaks of gray in her hair and a way of talking that made me feel like we already knew each other. She handed me the key in a little envelope with the words, "just in case," written across the front. Her final advice was simple. Make yourself at home, but don't worry too much if the house makes some noise. I laughed at that. I assumed she meant creaky pipes or wind tapping against the windows. I should have asked what she really meant. I moved in the following Friday just before sunset. The drive out was peaceful, the kind that starts to quiet the mind in a way you don't realize you needed until it's happening. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, I was immediately struck by how still the place felt. Not lifeless, but aware, somehow. The air was cool despite it being early summer, and the tall trees around the yard cast long shadows that seemed to reach toward the porch. I unlocked the door and stepped inside with a small suitcase in one hand and grocery bags in the other. The place smelled like lavender and dust, the kind of old, settled smell that houses seem to develop when left alone too long. Everything was clean, though immaculate even, not just vacuumed or wiped down, but polished. Too polished. The floors gleamed, the baseboards were spotless, even the kitchen faucet sparkled. I told myself it was just because Meredith was proud of her home. Maybe she had a cleaner come through before leaving. I wandered the rooms, flicking on lights, taking it all in. The living room had a large brick fireplace that clearly hadn't been used in years, judging by the way the iron grate was locked in place with a tiny chain. The walls were lined with bookshelves full of old hardcovers and dusty framed photographs I didn't recognize. People who must have been family, all of them frozen in moments of joy, but with the slightest sense that something was off about their eyes, like they weren't looking at the camera but just past it. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. I chose the one facing the front of the property, overlooking the driveway and the road beyond. That night, I made myself pasta, poured a glass of wine, and stretched out on the couch with one of the books from the shelf. I was halfway through the first chapter when I heard it. 3 slow creaks from upstairs, like someone had stepped across the floorboards above me. I sat up, heart pausing, the book still open in my lap. I listened for a minute, but there was nothing else. I assumed it was just the house settling like Meredith said, or maybe I was jumpier than I realized. I laughed under my breath, but something about the sound felt forced, as if I was trying to convince the house that I wasn't afraid. I checked the locks before going to bed, and I distinctly remember making sure the front door was not only locked, but that the deadbolt was turned fully and the handle was tight. I went upstairs, turned on the fan for background noise, and drifted to sleep faster than I expected. That first night, I dreamed of someone walking down the hallway outside my room. Slow steps on hardwood, a pause near my door, and then retreating. I woke up to silence, but when I opened the door and looked down the hallway, I swear I saw the floorboards closest to my door still vibrating slightly, as if they'd just been stepped on. I shook it off. I didn't even bring it up to anyone the next day. I figured my brain was adjusting to a new environment, but by the second night, the sounds were louder. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something shift in the kitchen, drawers opening. Maybe. I sat up in bed and held my breath, trying to separate reality from imagination. It stopped. When I walked downstairs, every drawer was closed, but one cabinet door under the sink was hanging open by about 6 inches. That was enough for a whisper of cold air to drift out and kiss my ankles. I closed it slowly, noticing the hinge squeaked in a way I hadn't heard when it opened. Something was wrong. I started checking the house more carefully. I installed a simple motion detector app on my phone and left it open on the coffee table while I slept. That night, it logged 3 separate activations. One at 2:08 a.m., another at 3:17, and one more at 4:41. I played the video back, and while it showed no movement, the audio had picked up a faint whisper. Just one word. My name. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I spent it pacing the hallway, phone in one hand, flashlight in the other. I told myself there had to be an explanation. An old recording device, a neighbor's television bleeding through the walls. Anything. But the closest home was nearly a mile away, and the sound was so intimate, so close, like it was spoken from just outside my bedroom door. When I texted Meredith to ask if anything strange had ever happened in the house, she replied an hour later with, "Just the usual creaks and groans. Nothing to worry about." That was the last time she responded to any of my messages. I called her 3 times over the next week, straight to voicemail. I checked the social feed where she first posted the job, but her profile had been deleted. I asked myself why I didn't leave then. I had every reason to, but some combination of curiosity and stubbornness kept me tethered to that place. Or maybe it wasn't entirely my choice. Maybe the house didn't want me to leave. The air inside started feeling heavier with each passing day, like walking through a room filled with unseen fog. I began noticing patterns, items moving, sounds that repeated in the same order, whispers at the same time each night. I found an old journal in the back of a hallway closet, wrapped in a flannel cloth and hidden beneath a pile of worn towels. It belonged to someone named Arthur. The first few pages were mundane, observations about the weather, grocery lists, dates. But then it changed. The entries grew scattered and paranoid. Mentions of things crawling behind the walls. Mentions of a woman who appeared at the edge of the woods each night, closer with every passing evening. The last entry simply said, "She lives in the house now. I only rent it." That sentence stuck with me, gnawed at my mind. She lives in the house now. I only rent it. I couldn't shake the image that conjured. A presence that had claimed the space, waiting for people like Arthur, like me. That night, I heard someone breathing outside my bedroom door. Not footsteps, not whispers, breathing. Long, slow inhalations, and then a pause, as if savoring the moment before exhaling. I sat frozen in bed for nearly an hour, phone clutched in my hand, too terrified to move. When I finally forced myself to open the door, the hallway was empty, but the air was warm, as if someone had just been standing there. The breathing didn't stop. It just moved. I'd hear it in different parts of the house at different times, like it was pacing, like it was watching me try to figure out how to get out. But by then, I was afraid to leave. I wasn't even sure if I could. I tried to drive away and forget which direction I came from. Roads would look unfamiliar, signs missing, GPS malfunctioning. I'd end up circling back to the same gravel driveway no matter which turn I took. My phone stopped making calls. Only text. Only data. I checked my call logs and found dozens of calls listed that I never made. All time-stamped at 3:17 a.m. All listed as unknown. Every voicemail was blank. Just static. One night, the static took shape. Started to sound like words forming in water. I realized it wasn't white noise. It was someone trying to speak through the line, through the walls, through me. And I knew then that the house wasn't haunted in the way most people think of it. It didn't have ghosts. It was a ghost. It had memory, hunger, a mind of its own. And I was the newest piece it had added to its collection. I stopped using the lights in certain rooms because I started to notice something deeply unsettling. Sometimes when I turned a light on, it wouldn't stay on. Not because of faulty wiring or a power issue, but because I could see something reacting to the light, something just past the edge of visibility, coiling away as if in pain. The bulbs would flicker violently for a few seconds before returning to normal, but the air would be different afterward, charged, electric, like the air before a storm but worse. I found myself moving through the house with only a flashlight or my phone's screen glow. I knew that sounded ridiculous, but I began to understand that some rooms simply didn't want to be seen. The worst one was the dining room. Nothing about it looked unusual at first. An old oval table, 6 chairs, a thin runner down the middle, dusty candles that had clearly never been lit in years. But I avoided it at all costs. If I left the door open at night, I would hear the chairs scrape softly, like they were being pushed back from the table. Sometimes I'd find them rearranged by morning, all facing outward like they'd been part of a meeting I'd just missed. I once set up a camera to watch it overnight, just a cheap webcam and my laptop. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my hands started trembling. For the first 2 hours, nothing moved. The video was perfectly still. But around 2:54 a.m., the image began to warp slightly, as if heat waves were passing over it. Then, slowly, the chairs began to pull away from the table one by one. Not violently, deliberately, methodically. Each scrape matched the sounds I'd heard. But what made me shut the laptop and throw it under the bed was what happened next. A shape began to take form in the seat closest to the window. Not a person, not even a shadow. It was more like a blur in the shape of a body, rippling slightly, pulsing like a heartbeat, and then it turned toward the camera and leaned forward. That was when the image cut out entirely. No error message, no technical glitch, just black. I didn't try again after that. The next day, I noticed the back door was unlocked. It had been bolted when I went to bed. I was certain of it. The locks were old, stiff. There's no way I could have forgotten turning the deadbolt with that old brass key that stuck every time. But it was wide open. Outside, the grass was wet with dew but had a single dry path leading from the door to the tree line. I stood at the edge of the porch and stared into those woods, heart pounding, eyes watering from the morning sun slicing between the branches. Something was out there, watching me, not with curiosity, not with confusion, with ownership, like it had let me borrow its home for a little while, and now it wanted it back. That night, I started hearing the piano. Meredith had a small upright piano in the sitting room, pushed against a wall beside the stairs. I hadn't touched it, never even walked close enough to notice the sheet music stacked on top. But that night, just past midnight, I heard a soft, broken melody drifting through the floorboards. I thought it was a neighbor. I told myself I must be hearing someone from another house. But when I went downstairs, the melody stopped the second my foot hit the last step. The air had that warm, heavy feeling again, and the piano bench was pulled out, angled slightly. A piece of sheet music I hadn't noticed before sat in the middle of the floor like it had been tossed there. I bent down to pick it up, and it was blank. Not a single note, just aged paper covered in long, deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way into the music. That was the same night I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I moved a blanket and pillow down to the living room couch, thinking I'd feel safer closer to the front door. I didn't. I only felt watched. The dreams got worse, sharper, more vivid. I'd dream of waking up on the couch, unable to move, while a shape hovered just above me, its arms impossibly long, its face a blur of static and teeth, whispering words I couldn't understand but knew were meant for me. Sometimes I'd actually wake up and find fresh scratches on my arms or the blanket folded in ways I never left it. I tried calling out to it one night, just said, out loud, "What do you want from me?" And for the first time, the house answered. Not in words, but in sound. Every light turned off at once. The air dropped 20 degrees. A pressure filled the room so heavy it made me drop to my knees. And then, laughter. Not booming or manic, just a quiet, throaty chuckle that came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was like the house was amused, like it was playing with me. I don't know how long I stayed on that floor, shaking. But eventually, the lights flicked back on one by one, and the air cleared. I didn't sleep at all. I sat awake until dawn, staring at the front door, daring it to open. It never did. But the scratches on my arm were deeper the next day. The real breaking point came 2 nights later. I was brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom when I noticed a crack in the mirror that hadn't been there before. At first I thought it was just damage from humidity or age, but as I leaned closer, I realized it wasn't a crack. It was a shape, a handprint, pressed into the silver backing of the mirror, like someone had reached through from the other side. 5 long fingers, each tipped with something sharp enough to etch glass. I stumbled back, nearly slipped on the rug, and when I looked again, it was gone. The mirror was perfectly smooth, but when I stepped out into the hallway, the lights were off again. Every door upstairs was wide open, even ones I hadn't entered. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was about to storm inside the house itself. I ran downstairs and decided then and there to leave. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, didn't even bother with my suitcase. I didn't care. I wanted out. I pulled open the front door, and the world outside had changed. The sky was dark, but not with night. It was like storm clouds had frozen in place just overhead, everything washed in a strange bluish gray that made it impossible to see further than a few yards. I took a step outside and felt my skin prickle, like walking through static electricity. The trees were still, too still, as if the world had stopped moving. I turned around, and the house was no longer behind me. It was something else, something tall and narrow and wrong. The porch I had just stepped off of was gone, replaced by a black stone path that led nowhere. I turned again, heart thudding so loud I thought I might pass out, and the house was back, just like it was. Same porch, same door, wide open. I ran. I got in my car and sped down the gravel driveway. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. And I didn't feel safe until I crossed the bridge 2 miles away and saw the town lights in the distance. When I got to a gas station, I tried to call Meredith again. The number had been disconnected. I went home. I didn't sleep. I didn't talk about it for a week. But then the calls started. Unknown numbers, voicemails with nothing but static and breathing. The first time, I told myself it was coincidence. The second time, I threw my phone across the room. When I replaced it, the same number called again, always at 3:17 a.m. And then I started seeing the scratch marks on my new apartment walls, on the inside of my closet door, under my pillow. I didn't bring anything with me from the house. I didn't need to. I think whatever was in that house didn't live there. It lived through there. I think the house is just a doorway, a mouth, and I'm one of the things it chewed and spat back out. But part of it stayed, and every night I feel it watching, not just from across the room, from inside the room, from inside me. I still dream of the house sometimes. I wake up sweating, my hands bleeding from clawing at my own arms. I've tried to move. I've tried to start over, but the door always finds me. Every city I've been to, every place I've tried to hide, I always see it eventually. That exact same house with its dark porch and tilted shutters, tucked just out of sight at the end of some forgotten street. Always waiting, always watching. I don't think I'll ever be free. I think it marked me, made me a part of its story, and now I exist only to be remembered by it, to feed it, to draw others closer, like you, like whoever's hearing this now. If you've ever passed a house that feels too quiet, that seems like it's watching you, keep walking. Don't look back. Don't stop. Because once you see it, really see it, it sees you too. And then it never lets go. After everything I had endured, I thought leaving that house would mean leaving the nightmare behind. But the truth was far more insidious. The darkness followed me, not just in my dreams, but in waking life, creeping into the corners of my vision and whispering in the static of silence. The scratches that had appeared on the walls of my apartment were only the beginning. They multiplied, spreading in patterns I couldn't decipher, forming jagged lines and eerie symbols that looked ancient, like a language I was only beginning to understand. My reflection in mirrors began to distort subtly, as if the glass itself resented holding my image. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of something standing just behind me, an elongated shadow with no clear form, and every time I whipped around, there was nothing. My phone's clock started glitching. It would freeze at 3:17 a.m. every night, the moment the door to that house had opened, as if marking time to some sinister ritual I couldn't escape. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers altogether, but the messages kept coming soft, distorted breathing and faint whispers, voices murmuring my name in a tone that was both mournful and mocking. Friends started to worry about me, but no one could see what I was seeing or hear the sounds that haunted my waking hours. One night, when sleep finally took me, the dream was more vivid than ever before. I was back in the house, standing in the dining room where the chairs had moved on their own, except this time the blurred figure from the camera footage was sitting at the table, watching me with hollow eyes. Its presence filled the room with cold so sharp I could see my breath in the air. And when it spoke, the voice wasn't human but something else, an ancient echo that rattled my bones. I awoke gasping for air, soaked in sweat, and in the dim light of my apartment, I noticed the scratches on my arms had deepened overnight, burning like fresh wounds. That day, I knew I had to return. Despite everything, the house was calling me back, pulling me toward the darkness it had sown inside me. I contacted a locksmith and arranged to get the original key duplicated, though I wasn't sure why I needed it anymore, since I wasn't certain the house was even real in the traditional sense. The night I drove back down the familiar gravel driveway, the air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees loomed above me, whispering secrets I couldn't comprehend. I parked the car and stood on the porch, hesitating for the first time in months. The door was closed, the lock intact, but I could feel the pulsing heartbeat of the house beneath my feet, a rhythm that synced with the pounding in my chest. I slid the key into the lock and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the darkness inside, waiting. I stepped over the threshold and the smell hit me. Faint hints of vanilla and something darker, metallic and decayed. The house felt alive, its walls breathing and shifting like the skin of some colossal creature. I walked through the rooms, each step stirring the dust that settled like memories on every surface. The dining room was as I remembered, chairs positioned just as they had been in my dream, the ghostly presence lingering like a shadow at the edge of my vision. The piano stood silent, but the sheet music was back on the floor, blank and scarred as before. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling the deep grooves where someone had clawed at it with desperate fury. Then the whispers started, soft at first, almost inaudible, but growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, only the tone, a mixture of warning and invitation. I felt eyes on me, countless unseen eyes watching from every dark corner. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the fading light. I realized I was not alone. Something moved in the shadows, coalescing into a shape that defied logic. Neither fully solid nor fully ghost, shifting between forms, limbs stretching impossibly long. It reached for me with fingers that seemed to pass through reality itself, and I staggered backward, heart hammering. The house groaned, the walls bending and rippling as if responding to the creature's presence. I fled upstairs, slamming doors behind me, but the darkness seeped beneath them like ink spilled on paper. The scratches on my arms flared with pain, and I knew then that the house was not just a place but a living prison. I understood, in that moment of terror, that the house never wanted me to leave. It had marked me, tethered me to its endless nightmare. And as the last sliver of light faded from the windows, the creature's eyes burned bright in the dark, watching, waiting for me to surrender. I screamed, but the house swallowed my voice, and the nightmare began anew. The house's grip on me tightened with every visit, every restless night spent trapped between waking and dreaming, the line dissolving until I couldn't tell which world I belonged to anymore. After that terrifying return, I started noticing that the very fabric of reality seemed to warp when I was near the house, or even when I thought about it. The trees lining the driveway shifted subtly, their branches contorting into shapes that resembled twisted faces watching me silently. The gravel path beneath my feet sometimes crunched as if I were walking on shattered bones instead of stones, a sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl. Inside the house, the walls whispered incessantly, murmurs slithering through the rooms like smoke, voices speaking in half-remembered languages, calling my name in syllables that burned my mind like acid. I tried to leave again, but every attempt ended with me lost in an endless maze of streets that looped back on themselves. The GPS on my phone malfunctioning, flickering between static and maps that led nowhere. I was trapped, both physically and mentally. The scratches on my arms became grotesque runes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark, and when I touched them, I felt the searing pain of unseen hands clawing beneath my skin. My dreams became darker, more vivid, each one replaying that same chilling scene. The blurred figure sitting at the dining table, its hollow eyes boring into my soul, whispering secrets I couldn't understand but that seeped into my waking thoughts, twisting my perception until I questioned everything. I became obsessed with the house's history, scouring online records and local archives, desperate for answers. I discovered that decades ago, a man named Arthur had lived there, the same name as the journal I found, and that he had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Neighbors recalled strange lights and sounds emanating from the property, but no one dared to go near it. More disturbingly, several people who had attempted to stay overnight had vanished, their last known locations all centered around that house. I tried to warn others, but my stories sounded like the ramblings of a madman. The isolation weighed heavily on me, and loneliness became my constant companion. One night, as I sat in my apartment, the power suddenly cut out, plunging me into suffocating darkness. The silence was broken by a faint tapping at the window, rhythmic and insistent, like the ticking of a clock counting down. I dared to look, and there, just beyond the glass, was the house's silhouette, its windows glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, the porch stretching out like a skeletal hand beckoning me closer. My heart pounded as I stepped back, only to find my own reflection replaced by that blurred figure, eyes black and empty, a smile that promised eternal torment. I screamed and covered my face, but the image remained burned behind my eyelids. Days later, I found myself standing before the house again, unable to resist its pull. The door creaked open on its own, and I stepped inside, swallowed once more by the oppressive darkness. I knew then that I was no longer a visitor. I was part of the house, a thread woven into its endless nightmare, bound forever to the place where time and reality unravel. And as the shadows closed in, I realized with a chilling certainty that the house doesn't just want to keep me. It wants to consume me entirely. Days bled into nights and nights into a haze of fragmented memories, each indistinguishable from the other, as if the house was slowly erasing my grasp on time itself. I could no longer trust my own senses. Sounds would echo and distort. Familiar faces warped into monstrous visages in fleeting glimpses that vanished the moment I blinked. The scratches on my arms and hands spread, forming patterns that seemed to writhe and shift beneath my skin, and sometimes I caught myself staring at my reflection in the mirror, only to see the blurred figure's empty eyes staring back, waiting. I became a prisoner to the shadows that clung to me, feeling their cold fingers brushing my neck in moments of silence, their breath heavy on my skin when no one else was near. Friends and family tried reaching out, concerned by my withdrawal, but I couldn't tell them what I was truly facing. The invisible weight pressing against my chest, the house's lingering presence pulling at my soul. One evening, driven by desperation, I returned to the house with a camera, hoping to capture proof of the terror that had stolen my life. The moment I stepped inside, a chilling breeze cut through the rooms, and the air thickened with whispers that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. As I moved through the dim halls, the camera lens fogged inexplicably, blurring the edges of the rooms, warping reality into a twisted nightmare. Then, at the end of the hallway, I saw it. The faint outline of a door that hadn't been there before, half hidden behind the peeling wallpaper, pulsing with a dull crimson glow. Against every instinct screaming to flee, I reached out and touched the door, and the house groaned like a living beast disturbed from slumber. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath me shuddered as the door creaked open, revealing a dark void beyond. From that abyss came a coldness so deep it felt like my very soul was being siphoned away, and within the darkness, countless eyes blinked open, watching, waiting. The house's voice whispered then, a low and terrible sound that echoed in my mind, promising release through surrender, a final union with the darkness that had claimed it. I staggered back, heart pounding, but as I turned to run, the walls closed in, the ceiling dropping, the room shrinking until I was trapped in a suffocating cage of shadow and silence. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed whole, replaced by laughter, soft, cruel, and endless. In that moment, I understood the terrible truth. The house didn't just hold memories or hauntings. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding on fear, on suffering, on the souls of those who dared enter. And I was its latest victim, destined to become a whisper in its endless chorus of torment. As the darkness consumed me, I vowed that if anyone ever heard my story, they would never step foot inside that cursed house. Because once it sees you, once it touches your mind and marks your flesh, there's no escape. The house waits for you, patient as a spider spinning its web, ready to drag you into the shadows where time is broken and nightmares never end. After what felt like an eternity trapped in that suffocating darkness, something shifted deep within me. An instinct to survive, to fight back against the crushing despair that threatened to swallow every shred of my humanity. Somehow, I pulled myself free from the grip of the house's oppressive hold, stumbling into the faintest flicker of dawn's light filtering through a cracked window. The air was still thick with cold and whispered threats, but the grip loosened, if only for a moment. I fled, racing down the hallway, past the rooms that seemed to stretch and twist beyond all reason, and out into the world that felt alien and unreal after what I'd endured. The morning sun was pale and cold as I reached my car, hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the keys. I drove away without looking back, but even as the house disappeared from view, its presence lingered like a shadow behind my eyes, an ache deep in my bones that no medicine or distraction could touch. Back in the safety of my apartment, I tried to rebuild a life, whatever that meant now, haunted by the ever-present feeling that I was being watched, followed by unseen eyes that blinked and whispered in the darkness of every room. Days stretched on, but sleep was no refuge. The nightmares clawed at me relentlessly, replaying every moment, every whisper, every distorted shape that had etched itself into my memory. I reached out to specialists, doctors, therapists, desperate for help, but no one could understand the shadows clinging to my mind or the marks that marred my flesh. Then, one night, the line between nightmare and reality blurred completely. As I lay in bed, paralyzed by terror, I felt the air shift. The room grew impossibly cold, and from the corner where darkness pooled like spilled ink, a figure emerged, tall and indistinct, its edges wavering like smoke caught in a breeze. It stepped closer, and I felt its gaze bore into me, ancient and merciless. I wanted to scream but found no sound. It reached out with fingers that stretched and twisted beyond natural limits and pressed them against my chest. Where it touched, the pain was exquisite and deep, as if it was tearing a hole in my very soul. The last thing I saw before consciousness faded was the flicker of the house's windows, glowing faintly through the dark. When I awoke, my apartment was flooded with morning light, but the presence remained. It whispered promises, threats, and riddles I could barely grasp. I knew, then, that the house's curse had followed me, that it was not bound by walls or distance but lived inside me, a parasite feeding on fear and despair. I am no longer just a person who survived that house. I am a vessel for its hunger, a shadow walking among the living. And every night, when the clock strikes 3:17, I feel the door to that nightmare open once more, calling me home. As the weeks turned into months, the invisible chains tethering me to that house tightened relentlessly, dragging me deeper into a waking nightmare I could neither escape nor fully understand. Every day felt like a battle to hold onto sanity as the scratches on my skin spread and multiplied, now forming intricate, almost ritualistic patterns that pulsed faintly under my fingertips like living tattoos. The symbols seemed to burn into my mind, flashing in dreams and fleeting glimpses at the edges of my vision, always reminding me that I was no longer alone in my own body. Friends and family began to distance themselves, frightened by the changes they saw in me. Dark circles that no amount of sleep could fix, a hollow look in my eyes, and a voice that sometimes faltered, as if someone else was trying to speak through me. I stopped answering calls, stopped going out, became a ghost in my own life, haunted by memories too terrible to share. I tried every possible explanation. Stress, trauma, psychosis, but deep down, I knew the truth was far more sinister. The house had marked me, made me part of its endless, twisted story, and now it fed off my fear and isolation like a parasite. One night, when the ticking of the clock reached its inevitable moment, 3:17 a.m., I felt the pull stronger than ever. The air in my apartment thickened, shadows lengthened, and the walls seemed to breathe, closing in like the house itself was reaching out through the veil separating dimensions. The scratches on my arms burned fiercely, and then the whispers began. A chorus of voices layered over one another, speaking in tongues I couldn't understand but instinctively feared. I staggered to the window and looked out into the street, expecting to see the house's dark silhouette looming in the distance. But there was nothing. Just the empty street, bathed in cold moonlight. Yet, I felt eyes on me, unseen but undeniable, watching from the void beyond. Then the room shifted. The familiar walls melted away, replaced by endless blackness pierced by cold, flickering lights that floated like distant stars. From that void, the blurred figure emerged once more, its hollow eyes locking with mine. It reached out, and I felt a terrible connection. A flood of memories not my own. Decades of pain, despair, and madness from every soul the house had consumed. I was a vessel, a conduit between worlds, trapped in a nightmare that was as ancient as it was endless. I screamed silently, a prisoner in my own mind, as the darkness tried to swallow me whole. But then, somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance ignited, a stubborn will to survive, to fight back against the house's hunger. I forced myself awake, breaking the grip of the nightmare, but I knew this was only the beginning. The house was not just a place. It was a living, malevolent force, patient, cunning, and eternal, and I was forever bound to its terrible legacy. Every night since then, when the clock strikes 3:17, I feel the door opening again, the shadows creeping closer, and the whispers calling me home. I share this story not to frighten you, but as a warning. Some places are better left empty, some doors better left unopened, and some houses not meant to be lived in. Because once you step inside, they don't just haunt you. They become a part of you, and there's no escape from the darkness that follows. Time became meaningless as the presence inside me grew stronger, seeping into every part of my being like ink spreading through water. The scratches on my skin no longer hurt. Instead, they pulsed with a rhythm all their own, sinking to a heartbeat I could feel but couldn't locate. Sleep became a distant memory as nightmares invaded every moment of rest, dreams bleeding into reality until I could no longer distinguish one from the other. In those dreams, the house appeared as a twisted monument, walls breathing and shifting like flesh, its windows glowing with a sickly light that promised oblivion. The blurred figure was always there, beckoning me forward, its hollow eyes filled with sorrow and malevolence. In waking hours, I felt watched constantly, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers curling around my thoughts. Attempts to reach out for help were futile. Friends drifted away, scared by the darkness that clung to me like a second skin. The house's influence stretched far beyond its physical location, a parasite feeding on fear, isolation, and despair. One night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I found myself drawn back to the house, standing at the edge of the porch with my heart pounding like a drum. The door creaked open, as if expecting me, and I stepped inside, swallowed by the cold, oppressive darkness. The walls seemed alive, pulsing and breathing, and the air was thick with whispers and laughter that echoed from unseen corners. I walked through the rooms, each one a twisted memory, a prison of shadows and sorrow. The piano's haunting melody drifted through the house, played by unseen hands, the notes twisted and broken like the house itself. In the dining room, the chairs sat facing outward, as if waiting for someone to return. The blurred figure appeared, sitting silently, watching me with hollow eyes that pierced my soul. I felt its cold fingers brush against my skin, and the scratches flared to life, burning like fire. I knew then that I was not a visitor. I was part of the house, a thread woven into its endless nightmare, bound forever to the place where time and reality unravel. The house whispered promises of release through surrender, a final union with the darkness that had claimed it. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance remained, a stubborn will to survive. I turned away and fled, the house's laughter chasing me into the night, a reminder that no matter how far I ran, the darkness would never let me go. I share this story as a warning. Some places are better left alone, some doors unopened, and some houses forgotten. Because once you step inside, they don't just haunt you, they become a part of you, and there's no escape from the darkness that follows. The weight of the house's curse clung to me like a second skin, seeping into every corner of my life, corrupting the simplest moments with an ever-present sense of dread. Days blurred into nights, and the scratches on my arms became a map of torment, intricate and maddening, pulsing beneath my skin as if alive, whispering secrets I was never meant to hear. My reflection distorted in mirrors, morphing into that blurred figure whose hollow eyes burned with an ancient hunger. Shadows slithered at the edges of my vision, creeping closer each time I dared to look away. Friends and family faded into distant memories, their voices drowned out by the house's insidious whispers echoing in my mind. I tried everything to escape, moving to new apartments, changing my phone number, even disappearing for stretches of time. But no matter where I went, the darkness followed, a suffocating presence lurking just beyond the veil of reality. At 3:17 a.m. every night, the world would shudder and shift. Time fractured and folded in on itself, dragging me back to that cursed porch, that endless maze of shadow and despair. The house was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, a predator patiently stalking its prey, waiting for the moment I would succumb entirely. And despite the terror, a part of me longed for the house's embrace, the cold certainty of its eternal nightmare. I knew that telling this story would not save me, nor warn me from the inevitable. It is a confession, a plea and a curse, bound to the house as surely as I am bound to these words. Beware the quiet places, the empty homes, the doors left ajar in the dark. Because once the house sees you, once it marks you with its claws, you are never truly alone again. And the nightmare does not end, it only begins. Eventually, I realized that fighting the house was futile. The scratches, the whispers, the shadows, they were no longer signs of a curse but markers of a bond one could never sever. The house didn't just haunt a place, it haunted the soul. I tried to resist, to hold on to who I was before it all began, but every attempt only pulled me deeper into its twisted embrace. The blurred figure, once a distant terror, became a part of me, its hollow eyes reflecting back every moment of pain, fear, and resignation. I stopped sleeping, stopped hoping for escape, and instead learned to exist in the liminal space between reality and nightmare where the house thrived. At 3:17 a.m., when the world seemed to pause, I felt the door to that nightmare open once more. Not just in the house, but inside me. It called me home, whispered promises of release through surrender. And in those moments, I understood that the house was not a place but a force, ancient, patient, eternal, that claimed those who dared cross its threshold. Now, I live with its presence as both curse and companion, a shadow in my mind that waits, watches, and remembers. And if you ever come across a house that feels too quiet, too empty, or too alive with silence, beware. Because some houses don't want to be cleaned, don't want to be left alone, and once they choose you, you belong to them forever. Story 2. I never thought house sitting for a stranger would turn into the worst nightmare of my life. It all started innocently enough. I was scrolling through a local Facebook group when I came across a post from someone looking for a house sitter while they traveled abroad for a few weeks. The house looked beautiful, nestled in a quiet, wooded neighborhood just outside of town, far enough to feel secluded, but close enough to civilization. The pay was decent and I was desperate for some extra cash, so I messaged the person, a man named Marcus, and after a few back and forths where he assured me the place was safe and everything I needed was there, I agreed. When I arrived, the house was even more stunning in person. Old, rustic, but immaculately kept, with a wraparound porch and windows that seemed to watch the forest outside like eyes. Marcus handed me the keys, told me he'd be back in a month, and reminded me to just take care of the place, nothing else. The first few days were peaceful, almost idyllic. I settled in, enjoying the quiet, cooking meals in the spacious kitchen, reading by the fireplace. But soon, strange things began to happen. The first night, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Soft, deliberate, like someone pacing. But when I opened the door, no one was there. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the house settling or maybe an animal outside. But the footsteps kept coming, always at night, always pacing back and forth just beyond my door. One night, I woke up to the sound of the front door creaking open. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and flashlight and crept downstairs. But again, no one was there. The door was still locked when I checked it, which made no sense. The locks had not been tampered with. As days passed, the house started feeling less like a peaceful retreat and more like a cage. Objects would move. My keys vanished for hours only to reappear on the kitchen counter. Lights flickered in empty rooms, and the old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed at odd hours, sometimes multiple times in a row with no one around. I tried calling Marcus to tell him what was happening, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I sent texts, emails, anything but silence. Then came the mirrors. I began noticing my reflection acted strangely, sometimes delayed, sometimes showing expressions I wasn't making. Once, I swear I saw something standing behind me in the mirror, a shadowy figure that vanished when I turned around. I tried convincing myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination, but the fear was growing, knotting in my stomach tighter every day. One night, I found a diary tucked behind a loose brick in the fireplace. It was old, yellowed with age, written in a messy scrawl by someone named Eleanor, who had apparently lived in the house decades ago. The entries detailed a descent into madness, paranoia about the watchers in the house, and a chilling obsession with the mirrors, which she believed were portals or eyes for something else. The last entry was abruptly cut off, ending with the words, "They won't let me leave." I laughed nervously, telling myself I was letting the isolation get to me. But then the real terror began. One evening, as I was cleaning, the house's power suddenly shut off, plunging me into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, but it flickered and died almost immediately. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whispering from the walls, growing louder, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The whispers formed words I could barely understand, telling me to stay, warning me that leaving wasn't an option. Panic overtook me as I ran to the door, trying the lock, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck and every window was sealed tight. I was trapped. Days blurred together as the house twisted reality around me. The mirrors multiplied, reflecting not just my image but distorted, grotesque versions of the house's interior, endless corridors that shouldn't exist, and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. I stopped trying to escape, realizing the house had claimed me. I was a prisoner, a caretaker for something ancient and hungry. And when I finally saw Marcus again, through a mirror that didn't show my reflection but his, he told me, without words, that I was never meant to leave. The house was waiting, and so was I. After that terrifying realization, I stopped trying to rationalize what was happening. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, breathing with some malevolent intelligence that toyed with me like a trapped animal. The mirrors, which once seemed like strange curiosities, became portals, windows into other parts of the house that didn't physically exist. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of rooms I'd never seen before, vast halls dripping with darkness, or shadowy figures pacing silently behind glass that wasn't there before. The whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, calling me by name, promising release if only I would surrender to the house's will. The scratches on the walls appeared overnight, jagged and deep, looking like desperate claw marks made by someone, or something, trying to escape. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping, my body wasting away as the house consumed me from the inside out. Then came the nights when the front door would slam open on its own, even though the locks were secure, and I'd hear heavy footsteps thudding down the stairs, echoing through the rooms like the heartbeat of the house itself. I tried leaving, every chance I got, but the house would rearrange itself, hallways twisting and corridors shifting, trapping me in a labyrinth with no exit. My phone stopped working, calls wouldn't go through, and the battery drained in minutes no matter what I did. It was like the house was cutting me off from the outside world, isolating me in its suffocating grip. The only time I felt any relief was during the brief moments before 3:17 a.m., when everything seemed to hold its breath, the shadows retreating just enough to let me catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror without the distortion. But at exactly 3:17, the house would come alive again. The door would creak open, and the presence would return, darker and closer than ever. I began to lose track of time, of who I was before this nightmare began. The diary of Eleanor was my only companion, her frantic scrawls echoing my own spiraling sanity. Her warnings about the watchers and the mirrors became my reality. I even started speaking to her through the pages, writing questions, desperate for answers, hoping for some sign that I wasn't alone. But the house answered in its own way. Objects would shift overnight. New scratches appeared on the walls, forming symbols I couldn't decipher, and sometimes the whispering voices would answer back. It wasn't long before I realized the house was trying to communicate, to make me part of its story, part of its eternal hunger. One night, while trapped in this endless cycle, I saw something horrifying, a reflection in the mirror that wasn't mine. It was Marcus, the man who'd given me the keys, but his eyes were empty voids, his face twisted in a silent scream. He was trapped too, or worse, maybe he was the one who'd been trapped all along, the house's first victim. I tried to tear myself away, but the house pulled me back with a force I couldn't resist. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the feeling of cold fingers brushing against my skin, the house's breath on my neck, and the chilling realization that I was never going to leave. The house had me now. I was part of it. And the mirrors, they weren't just windows. They were doors. The line between reality and nightmare blurred until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Every mirror in the house became a gateway to a twisted reflection of my own mind. A labyrinth of shifting corridors, dark rooms filled with echoes of laughter and screams I couldn't place, and shadowy figures that vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. I spent hours trapped in front of these mirrors, watching scenes unfold like fragmented memories, some terrifying, some strangely familiar, but all hauntingly incomplete. It was as if the house was showing me pieces of a puzzle I wasn't meant to solve, fragments of lives intertwined with mine in ways I couldn't comprehend. My own reflection morphed constantly. Sometimes it was me, other times a hollow shell, a mask with empty eyes, and occasionally, the blurred figure that had haunted my dreams and waking moments. Sleep became impossible as the house invaded every corner of my existence. The whispers grew louder, no longer soft murmurs but harsh commands, telling me to stay, to give in, to become part of the house forever. I tried to resist, desperately clinging to the hope that I could escape this place and reclaim my life, but every attempt was thwarted by the house itself. Doors I swore I'd opened led to walls, hallways looped back on themselves endlessly, and windows revealed nothing but black voids or distorted reflections of places I didn't recognize. One night, driven by desperation, I smashed one of the large mirrors in the living room, hoping to break the connection, but the glass didn't shatter. Instead, it rippled like water, and through it, I saw a dark figure reaching out to me, its fingers long and twisted. Panic overwhelmed me as I stumbled backward, but when I looked again, the mirror was solid and intact, showing only my terrified reflection. That moment shattered what little sanity I had left. I realized the house was not just a place. It was a living, breathing entity that fed on fear and despair, binding its victims through these reflective portals. I was trapped in a prison of mirrors, a maze with no exit, and the house was the monstrous jailer. The scratches on my skin deepened, throbbing with a terrible energy, and my thoughts became invaded by the dark presence lurking within the glass. I no longer feared death, only the endless torment of this place. But then, in the depths of my despair, I found something unexpected, a faint glimmer of hope. The diary of Eleanor, the madwoman who had once tried to escape the house's grasp, contained cryptic notes about a way out, hidden in the patterns of the scratches on the walls and the shifting reflections. It hinted at a ritual, a moment of vulnerability when the house's power waned, and the trapped souls could break free. I clung to the sliver of hope, gathering the courage to face the darkness, knowing that the house would fight back with everything it had. The mirrors pulsed with energy, and the blurred figure watched silently, waiting to see if I would succeed or be consumed forever. I prepared myself for the final confrontation, aware that the outcome would change everything. Either I would escape this nightmare, or the house would claim me completely, adding my story to its endless collection of lost souls. The moment of reckoning arrived on a night when the air was thick with a silence so heavy it pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I traced the cryptic patterns from Eleanor's diary on the walls, the scratches glowing faintly under the flickering light of a dying candle. The mirrors around me warped and twisted, reflecting not just my image but flickers of other lives, other souls trapped within the house's grasp, their faces contorted in eternal torment. As the clock neared 3:17 a.m., the house seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive weight of its presence tightening like a noose. I began the ritual, chanting the broken words Eleanor had scrawled, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each syllable. The air rippled and shimmered, and the blurred figure appeared before me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine, a silent scream etched across its face. Shadows twisted and coiled around us, the house groaning like a living beast fighting to keep its prey. Pain surged through my body as the scratches flared, and I felt the cold fingers of the house trying to pull me back into the abyss. But I resisted, fueled by a desperate hope and the promise of freedom. The mirrors shattered one by one, their shards exploding into darkness that hissed and writhed, dissolving into nothingness. The walls trembled, and the floor cracked beneath me as the house's hold weakened. For a fleeting moment, I glimpsed the outside world, the soft glow of dawn breaking through the forest, the scent of fresh air filling my lungs. Then, with a final scream that echoed through the void, the house collapsed inward, a vortex of shadow and light swallowing itself whole. I stumbled out into the cold morning, gasping for breath, the weight lifted but the scars on my skin still burning. The house was gone, or at least the version that had held me captive. But even now, in the safety of daylight, I feel the lingering presence, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a whisper carried on the wind. The mirrors have all been removed from my new home, but sometimes, when the light hits just right, I catch a glimpse of that blurred figure in the glass, watching, waiting. I don't know if the house was truly destroyed or if its darkness simply followed me, tethered to my soul forever. All I know is that I survived, but the nightmare never truly ends. And sometimes, late at night, when the clock ticks past 3:17, I swear I hear the faint creak of a door opening, calling me back to the place I was never meant to leave. Time lost all meaning as the invisible chains binding me to that accursed house tightened with merciless persistence. Each passing day dragging me deeper into a waking nightmare I could no longer escape or fully comprehend. The scratches that marred my skin multiplied and wove themselves into intricate, cryptic patterns, like a maddening tattoo pulsing beneath the surface, each one whispering secrets from the dark corners of the house's malevolent soul. Sleep became an impossible refuge as night after night, my dreams twisted into torturous visions of endless halls that stretched beyond reality, rooms where shadows breathed and walls wept blood, and mirrors that reflected not just my face but the dark essence of the house itself. Hollow eyes, twisted figures, and that ever-present blurred silhouette that haunted the edges of my vision. The house was no longer just a building. It was a living entity feeding on fear, despair, and isolation, and it claimed every part of me. Friends and family, once a tether to the outside world, faded into distant memories as the darkness spread. A suffocating fog in my mind that drowned out their voices and left me alone with the whispers that grew louder every night. At precisely 3:17 a.m., when the clock struck that cursed hour, the world around me seemed to warp and shift, the air thickening until reality itself felt fragile and unreal. The house's door creaked open in my mind, inviting me back to its unholy embrace where the blurred figure awaited. No longer just a specter, but a dark twin bound to my soul, watching and waiting to pull me beneath the surface into an abyss of madness and despair. Attempts to escape were futile. Doors vanished or led me in endless circles. The windows reflected infinite voids, and my phone, once a lifeline, betrayed me, Calls failed, batteries drained as if drained by unseen forces intent on isolating me completely. In the suffocating silence between nightmares, the diary of Eleanor was my only companion. Her frantic scrawls a mirror of my own unraveling mind and the desperate hope that there might be a way out. But the house answered with cruel riddles and deeper darkness, its hunger insatiable and eternal. One night, driven beyond reason, I confronted the mirrors, their surfaces rippling like water, and the blurred figure emerged from the glass, its cold gaze piercing through me as if reading the darkest secrets of my soul. Its long, twisted fingers reached out, brushing my skin with a chill that burned like fire, and I knew in that moment that surrender meant oblivion, and resistance meant eternal torment. But deep inside, a flicker of defiance sparked, a last desperate hope to reclaim my life and escape the prison of shadows. I began to piece together Eleanor's fragmented ritual, a complex dance of symbols and whispered words meant to sever the house's hold. As the clock approached 3:17 a.m., I prepared for a final confrontation with the darkness that claimed me, knowing that either I would break free or be consumed forever, swallowed by the endless nightmare the house had become. The mirrors began to shatter in a cascade of exploding glass and swirling shadows. The house's walls trembled and groaned, and the world seemed to collapse in on itself as the battle between light and dark raged within and without. And then, as dawn's pale light touched the horizon, I found myself standing outside, the oppressive weight lifted, the house's silhouette vanishing like a fading nightmare. But even in freedom, the scars remain, etched on my skin, engraved on my soul, and sometimes, when the night is still and the clock ticks close to 3:17, I catch a glimpse of that blurred figure in the corner of a mirror or the shadow of a passing breeze, reminding me that the house is never truly gone. It waits, patient and eternal, and I carry its darkness with me wherever I go, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some houses, once entered, never truly let you leave. The days that followed my escape from the house felt like moving through a fog thicker than any nightmare I had endured inside those cursed walls. The world outside continued, oblivious to the shadow that now clung to me, an invisible tether pulling me back to that prison of reflections and whispered madness. The scratches on my skin had settled into permanent marks, a living map of torment that pulsed with every heartbeat, reminding me that the house's curse was not bound by place but had become a part of me, woven into my very flesh and blood. Sleep remained a battleground. The moment I closed my eyes, the blurred figure appeared, no longer distant or ghostly but vivid and unrelenting, its hollow gaze burning into my mind's eye. It whispered promises of release through surrender, a cold comfort I resisted with everything I had left, even as my sanity frayed at the edges. Mirrors terrified me now. Objects I once avoided became monstrous gateways, portals through which the house could peer into my new life, probing for weakness, seeking to reclaim what it had lost. Friends and loved ones tried to reach me, but I was a ghost to them, withdrawn, haunted, consumed by the ever-present sense of being watched, stalked by a darkness that waited patiently in the corners of my vision. The clock became my enemy, a relentless reminder of the house's hold, as every night at 3:17 a.m., the world seemed to fracture, the air thickening, and a cold pressure pressing down on my chest. It was then that the door to that nightmare would crack open again, and I would feel the pull of the house's presence, calling me back, whispering my name in voices that were both familiar and monstrous. Despite my terror, a part of me longed for that dark embrace, the certainty of its hunger, the cold finality of surrender. But I fought, knowing that giving in meant losing myself forever, becoming yet another ghost trapped in that labyrinth of glass and shadows. I turned to rituals, ancient texts, and desperate prayers, grasping for any thread of hope to sever the bond. Yet the house's influence only grew stronger, manifesting in shadows that moved with intent, voices that echoed from the depths of mirrors, and nightmares that bled into waking hours. One night, as the clock approached that cursed hour, I felt the presence materialize beside me. Not as a distant shadow, but a weight pressing into my very soul, cold fingers curling around my heart. I whispered Eleanor's name, the only anchor I had left, and in that fragile moment, the house recoiled, its hold loosening just enough for me to step back into the fading light of dawn. But the scars on my skin still burned, and the whispers never ceased. The house was gone, or so I told myself, but the darkness it planted within me was eternal, a seed growing in the fertile soil of fear, waiting for the day I would falter and open the door once more. The darkness inside me grew heavier with each passing day, an oppressive weight that seeped into every part of my life like poison. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I told myself the house was gone, the shadows clung tightly, twisting reality around me. The scratches on my skin had spread, intricate patterns that now resembled symbols etched by unseen hands, and they pulsed faintly, a silent reminder that the house's mark was not just on my flesh but deep within my soul. Sleep remained a battlefield. Every night was haunted by dreams where the walls of the house closed in on me, its endless corridors stretching into infinity, populated by faceless figures and that blurred specter with hollow eyes that seemed to watch my every move. The whispers persisted, shifting from unintelligible murmurs to sharp commands, voices that echoed in my mind, urging me to surrender, to return to the place where I truly belonged. I isolated myself, pushing away the few friends who dared to reach out, terrified that the darkness would consume them too. Mirrors became objects of dread. I avoided them, covered them, or turned away quickly whenever I caught a glimpse of a reflection that wasn't quite my own. The house was no longer a physical place but a living nightmare woven into the fabric of my existence. On nights when the clock neared 3:17 a.m., my heart would race, and an unbearable pressure would press down on me, as if the door to that cursed realm was opening once more, calling me back with a voice that was both familiar and cruel. Despite my terror, I felt a twisted pull toward the darkness, a part of me longing for the release only the house could offer. But deep inside, I fought fiercely, clinging to the last shreds of hope and humanity. I scoured ancient texts, sought help from those who studied the occult, and performed countless rituals, anything to sever the bond. Yet every attempt seemed only to feed the darkness, making it stronger and more relentless. One night, as the world held its breath and the clock struck 3:17, the air thickened, shadows coalesced into forms both human and monstrous, and the blurred figure emerged from the mirror, its hollow eyes boring into mine, whispering promises of oblivion. I steeled myself, chanting the ritual Eleanor had left behind, my voice breaking but growing steadier with each word. The mirrors around me cracked and splintered, shards falling like rain as the house howled in fury. For a brief, shining moment, the darkness receded, and I felt the chains loosen. But the scars remained, etched deep, a constant reminder that some nightmares never truly end. And sometimes, when the night is still and the clock ticks close to 3:17, I catch the faintest whisper, the coldest breath, and I know the house is still with me, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment I falter and the door swings open once more. The days that followed felt like living underwater, as though the very air I breathed had thickened into something viscous and suffocating. The scratches on my arms glowed faintly in the dark, throbbing like a second heartbeat, syncing with the steady tick of the old grandfather clock I never dared to wind. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more demanding, filling every silent moment with threats and half-remembered names, dragging me deeper into a waking nightmare where shadows twisted into faces I couldn't quite see but knew were watching. My reflection in every glass surface became a warped, fractured version of myself, sometimes smiling with a malicious grin I had never worn, sometimes staring back with empty, hollow eyes like the blurred figure from the house. Sleep became a battleground I lost night after night, each dream more vivid, more real than the last, until I no longer knew which world was mine. The walls seemed to breathe, exhaling icy cold that crawled beneath my skin and settled into my bones. Every door I tried to open led only to more darkness, more endless corridors where the blurred figure lurked just out of reach, whispering promises of release if only I would surrender. I avoided mirrors at all costs, but even their absence could not protect me. The darkness found me in reflections of puddles, in the gleam of a polished spoon, even in the glossy surface of my phone's screen. Friends drifted away, their faces blurred and distant, their voices muffled beneath the constant roar of the house's voice in my head. The clock remained my tormentor. 3:17 a.m. was no longer just a time but a curse, a fixed point where reality warped and the door to that nightmare swung wide open again. I fought with every shred of strength left in me to resist, clutching the fading words of Eleanor's diary like a lifeline, hoping against hope that her ritual could still save me. But the house was patient, eternal, a predator waiting for the moment I gave up, and I feared that moment was closer than ever. And yet, somewhere in the depths of this nightmare, a fragile ember of hope remained, burning dimly but defiantly against the encroaching dark, whispering that the story wasn't over. Not yet. As the days blurred into nights and back again, the house's grip on me tightened in ways I couldn't escape or explain, twisting the very fabric of my reality until I was nothing more than a prisoner of its endless, shifting nightmare. The scratches on my skin deepened and spread, intricate patterns that pulsed faintly with a cold, unnatural energy. An unrelenting reminder that the house had marked me, branded me as its own. The mirrors multiplied, their surfaces no longer reflecting just my image but fragments of shadowy figures lurking behind the glass. Faces twisted in silent screams and hollow eyes that followed my every move. The whispers had evolved into voices, relentless and invasive, speaking in a language older than time itself, promising freedom if I would just surrender, just become part of the house's eternal collection of lost souls. I tried everything: prayers, rituals, ancient texts, even desperate pleas to strangers who claimed to have knowledge of the occult. But nothing severed the dark tether binding me. At exactly 3:17 a.m. each night, time fractured and bent, and the house's presence surged, the door in my mind creaking open, inviting me back into the labyrinth of shadows. One night, as the clock approached that cursed hour, I stood before the largest mirror, clutching Eleanor's diary, her faded words etched into my memory. The room trembled, shadows twisted and stretched, and the blurred figure emerged from the glass, reaching out with fingers like cold steel. I began the ritual, voice trembling but growing stronger, reciting the ancient incantation that promised to break the chains. The mirrors shattered in a cascade of glittering shards, the house's walls groaned and cracked, and a blinding light tore through the darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was outside, the first rays of dawn warming my face. The house was gone, vanished like a bad dream, but the scars remained, etched into my flesh and soul. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that the house is still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment I falter and the door to that nightmare swings wide once more. Even now, years later, the house's shadow lingers, an unseen weight that presses against my chest and steals my breath in quiet moments. The scratches on my skin have faded but never disappeared, faint scars that remind me daily of what I endured and what still lives inside me. Mirrors remain objects of terror. I avoid them when I can, but sometimes, when the light hits just right, I swear I see that blurred figure watching from within, waiting patiently, silently, like a predator stalking its prey. The clock still haunts me, the relentless ticking, the way time seems to slow and then snap at 3:17 a.m., and with it, the dread that the door to that nightmare may open once more. I've tried to move on, to rebuild my life, but the darkness is woven into the very fabric of my soul, a permanent tether I cannot sever. Friends who once believed me now keep their distance, afraid or unsure, and I can't blame them. I have learned that some places don't just haunt the living, they claim them, they consume them. The house was never just a building. It was a living, breathing evil, patient and eternal, waiting to trap the next careless soul. And now, I understand with bone-deep certainty that no matter how far I run or how fiercely I fight, the house will always find me. Because once it chooses you, you belong to it forever. The nightmare never truly ends. It only waits, biding its time until the door swings open again and the darkness claims you whole. Story 3. I never thought a vacation could turn into a nightmare until we found the camera. My girlfriend and I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a brutal year of work stress and everything else, we decided to rent a cozy Airbnb cabin deep in the woods, somewhere quiet, secluded, away from the chaos of city life. The listing promised everything: rustic charm, modern amenities, privacy. We arrived late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the wooden porch. The host was friendly, gave us a quick tour, and handed over the keys. The house was perfect: warm wood floors, a crackling fireplace, and a big, comfortable bed with soft linens that practically begged you to sink in after a long day. We unpacked, cooked dinner, and settled in for what should have been a peaceful night. That's when I noticed something odd. While pulling back the curtains, I caught a glint of metal tucked behind a bookshelf across from the bed. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or maybe a piece of wiring. But as I moved closer, the glint turned into the unmistakable lens of a tiny camera. My heart stopped. It was hidden, facing directly toward the bed. We stared at it in silence, shock and disbelief washing over us. How long had it been there? Was it recording us? The thought made my skin crawl. We tore apart the room, searching for more devices, more cameras. To our horror, we found several tiny, hidden in smoke detectors inside a clock, even in a power outlet. It was everywhere. We called the host, who was unreachable. Then the police, who said we were the third couple to report cameras in that property in recent months. Felt like we were in a horror movie, except this was real. And it was worse than we imagined. Because when we got access to the footage, what we saw, well, it haunts me to this day. After discovering the hidden camera, we didn't sleep a wink that night. The cabin, which had seemed so cozy and inviting just hours before, transformed into a sinister trap cloaked in shadows and paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window, felt like a threat lurking just beyond sight. We debated leaving immediately, but it was late. The roads were dark and winding, and honestly, part of me felt frozen, caught in disbelief and horror that this was happening to us. We scoured the entire cabin again, checking every nook and cranny for cameras or bugs. It was like an invasion of privacy, a violation so profound that it felt personal. We found cameras concealed inside vents, behind picture frames, and even in a small, innocent-looking smoke detector in the kitchen. The meticulousness was terrifying. The cameras weren't just there to watch. They were positioned to capture the most intimate and vulnerable moments. The thought churned inside me, making my stomach knot and my skin crawl. We tried contacting the Airbnb host multiple times. Phone calls went straight to voicemail, emails bounced back, and the profile we booked through was suddenly deactivated. It was like they vanished. The police arrived the next morning, took our statements, and assured us they'd investigate. But there was little they could do immediately. They warned us about how tech-savvy criminals could install cameras in rental properties to spy on guests. But until they found concrete evidence or caught whoever was behind this, there was no immediate solution. That's when we asked for the footage. We thought maybe, just maybe, the cameras weren't operational or someone else had caught them first. But when the police handed us the drives, what we saw was far worse than any nightmare I could imagine. The videos showed us entering the cabin, unloading our bags, laughing, settling in, every moment recorded in horrifying clarity. But there were other clips, too. Footage of us asleep, of us arguing quietly in the night, and chillingly, footage that captured things we couldn't explain. Shadows moving on their own, fleeting figures at the edge of the frame, distorted faces staring directly at the camera before vanishing in a blink. The more we watched, the more unsettled we became. The videos seemed to capture something beyond mere surveillance. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, watching, waiting, and the cameras were its eyes, not just recording us, but somehow interacting with whatever dark presence inhabited the place. One night, after a long day of no sleep and endless watching, I caught movement in the reflection of the screen. A face peering from behind the curtains, a pale figure with empty eyes and a twisted smile. But when I spun around, the room was empty, the curtains still hanging motionless. It was the moment I realized we weren't just being watched. We were trapped in a nightmare that had taken physical form inside that cabin. Our paranoia spiraled into terror, every sound a potential threat, every shadow a lurking evil. We packed hurriedly the next morning, but even as we drove away, the feeling of being followed, of being hunted, clung to us. The camera footage was submitted as evidence, but the nightmare didn't end there. We found copies of some videos leaked online, anonymous messages threatening us to keep quiet, and strange phone calls where the line went dead the moment we answered. I'm telling this now because I want people to be aware. This kind of violation happens more often than you think, and sometimes the terror isn't just about who's watching, but what's watching alongside them. The cabin was more than a place with hidden cameras. It was a doorway to something far darker, something that still haunts me in every quiet moment. In the days that followed our escape from that cabin, the feeling of being watched never left me. Even in the safety of my own home, every creak of the floor, every flicker of a shadow made my heart pound with primal fear. The knowledge that someone or something had invaded our most private moments clung to me like a second skin. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the police would catch whoever was responsible and shut this nightmare down. But the truth was far more sinister. The footage we saw was just the beginning. Strange things started happening that I couldn't explain. My phone would randomly turn on, showing static before flickering to a brief image of that cabin room, with the bed and the curtains fluttering as if someone was standing just out of view. Lights flickered in my apartment at odd times. Shadows darted across walls when no one was there, and I sometimes caught faint whispers through my phone's speaker that disappeared the moment I tried to listen. It was as if whatever presence had been watching us in the cabin had followed me home, anchoring itself through the cameras, through technology, feeding on my fear and isolation. I found myself obsessively checking every electronic device, tearing apart my home looking for bugs, cameras, anything that might be connected to that hellish place. The paranoia became a prison. I stopped going out, stopped answering my phone, even avoided mirrors because I felt like those reflections could betray me, reveal the watcher lurking just behind my image. Nights were the worst. Every sound amplified. Every creak of the house or distant siren became a signal that the nightmare was creeping closer. The images from the footage replayed in my mind. The blurred figure by the window, the face with hollow eyes staring through the darkness, the distorted shadows that didn't match any physical presence. I knew rationally that these could be glitches or tricks of light, but deep down, I feared they were real. I was being stalked not just by a person with a camera, but by something malevolent that used those cameras as its eyes. The more I tried to escape, the stronger the presence became, invading my dreams and waking hours alike. Friends who tried to reach out grew distant, unable to understand the madness I was sinking into, and I couldn't blame them. The isolation fed the darkness, and the darkness fed the isolation. The police investigations dragged on with no answers, and the Airbnb listing disappeared. The host vanished without a trace. I realized this was more than a simple invasion of privacy. It was a carefully orchestrated nightmare, designed to trap and torment, to watch as fear consumed us. Every time I thought I was safe, a new message would arrive. Anonymous, cryptic, a reminder that the watcher was still there, unseen but ever present. And so, I live now in a constant state of dread, knowing that the camera that watched us in that Airbnb cabin was just the beginning of something far worse, a horror that continues to watch me, waiting for the moment I look away. After weeks of relentless fear and paranoia, my life began to unravel in ways I never imagined possible. Sleep was a distant memory. Nights were haunted by shadows crawling just beyond my vision and the ever-present feeling of eyes drilling into my back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin, the bed, the curtains, the tiny lens of that hidden camera staring back at me like a malevolent eye. The police investigation stalled, frustratingly slow and inconclusive. The footage we had handed over was locked away somewhere, inaccessible and forgotten, while the anonymous threats continued. My phone buzzed with cryptic texts from unknown numbers, messages that were sometimes just strings of static, other times chilling warnings. We're still watching. You belong to us now. Don't look away. The idea that someone was stalking me, tracking me through technology, was terrifying enough, but the deeper horror was the creeping suspicion that the presence wasn't just human. There were moments when the air turned icy cold without explanation, when objects moved slightly out of place, or when my reflection in the mirror warped and twisted into something unrecognizable. A face with hollow eyes and a sinister grin. Friends tried to help, but I pushed them away, fearful that even they could be compromised, that this darkness could spread through contact. The isolation became suffocating, a prison built from fear and silence. I started installing my own cameras around my home, desperate to catch the intruder, but all they captured were flickering shadows and strange, static-filled footage where faces sometimes appeared and disappeared too quickly to identify. One night, as the clock approached 3:17 a.m., that cursed time when everything seemed to distort, I awoke to the sound of breathing, soft, labored, right next to my ear. I froze, heart pounding, and slowly turned to find the room empty, yet the air thick with a presence that was both terrifying and palpable. The line between reality and nightmare blurred until I no longer knew which world I inhabited. The camera in the Airbnb was more than just a device for voyeurism. It was a gateway, a conduit for something dark and ancient that feeds on fear and violation. The footage was never just recordings. It was an invitation, a way to reach through screens and walls and pull victims into its endless, watching void. And now it watches me. I can only warn others to be careful, to check every inch of the places they stay, because sometimes the things that watch us aren't human. And sometimes, once you're seen, there's no escaping the eyes that never blink. The line between nightmare and reality blurred more and more with each passing day. My mind felt like it was unraveling as the shadows deepened around me. The constant feeling of being watched invaded every moment. In my apartment, on the street, even in the safety of my car. I found myself double-checking every reflection, every surface, terrified that the watcher could be lurking just behind me, or worse, inside me. Friends stopped calling, or when they did, their voices sounded distant, as if they were speaking from underwater. I isolated myself, afraid that the darkness would reach through the phone or the door and consume them. 2. I became obsessed with technology, scanning devices, changing passwords, tearing apart electronics in search of a hidden camera, a microphone, anything. But the terror only grew. Every device I touched seemed to hum with a sinister energy, and sometimes, late at night, I would hear faint whispers in the static, soft voices speaking in languages I couldn't understand but that sent chills racing down my spine. I couldn't tell if the voices were in my head or coming from somewhere else, but they never stopped. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I drove back to the town where the cabin was located, hoping to find answers or at least face the place that had stolen my peace. The air was thick and cold, and the streets were deserted except for the occasional flicker of a distant porch light. When I reached the cabin, it stood abandoned, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing the familiar but twisted interior where the nightmare began. I found the same spots where the cameras had been hidden, long since removed or destroyed, but the walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the house itself was alive and watching. In the corner of the main room, I found a small, cracked mirror, and as I gazed into it, the surface rippled like water. For a terrifying moment, I saw not my own reflection but the blurred figure from the footage, pale, distorted, with empty eyes staring back at me, mouthing words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, heart racing, and fled into the night, the house's cold breath on my neck. Since then, the terror never leaves me. The camera was just the beginning, a beacon for something dark and ancient that now knows my face, my fears, my secrets. It watches through screens, through shadows, through the cracks in my mind. And no matter where I go, it waits, patient and eternal, until I look away. In the weeks that followed my return to that cursed town, my life spiraled deeper into a waking nightmare that refused to end. The blurred figure from the mirror haunted every corner of my mind. An indelible image burned behind my eyes, its hollow gaze accusing and unrelenting. I tried to piece together what I had missed, what secrets the cabin held that allowed such evil to lurk beneath its innocent facade. Local whispers hinted at a dark past, stories of previous renters who vanished without a trace, strange rituals performed by the original owner, and a lineage of madness tied to the land itself. But every lead I chased dissolved into silence or shadow, leaving me with nothing but the growing terror that I had become a permanent target. My devices continued to betray me. Phones rang with no one on the line. Cameras recorded static that twisted into distorted faces. Messages appeared on my screen, sometimes gibberish, sometimes chilling threats. I became a ghost in my own life, watching from the edges as relationships withered and friends disappeared into distance and doubt. Sleep was a battleground where I fought phantoms and whispers, and the clock's cruel hand ticking toward 3:17 a.m. became my worst enemy, the time when the veil thinned and the house's malevolence reached out to claim me once more. Then one night, in a fit of desperation, I set up my own camera, facing the bed, the way they had done in that cabin, and left it running, hoping to capture something that could explain or maybe exorcise the darkness. What I saw in that footage broke me. Shadows coalesced into forms, figures moving with unnatural grace, faces twisting into smiles that didn't reach their eyes. And in the corner, just out of clear view, the blurred figure stood waiting, watching me, a silent sentinel of the nightmare that had become my life. The camera had become a portal, a tether binding me to that place, and maybe to something worse. I realized then that the horror was not just about being watched, but about being trapped, caught in a web of fear and silence spun by an entity that thrived on control and despair. Now, I warn anyone who will listen. Be wary of what you invite into your home, especially when it comes disguised as a place of refuge. Sometimes the eyes watching you are not human, and sometimes the nightmare is far from over. Every day since then has been a battle to hold on to what's left of my sanity, a constant war against the creeping dread that the watcher isn't just a memory or a ghost in the machine, but something that lives inside me now. I find myself scanning every room I enter, checking behind curtains, inside vents, beneath furniture, always expecting to find another hidden eye staring back at me. The paranoia is suffocating, but what terrifies me even more is the creeping sense that this presence has learned my habits, knows my fears, and waits patiently for the moment I let my guard down. Nights are torture. Sleep offers no relief. Instead, it brings visions of the cabin's walls closing in, the blurred figure reaching out with cold, shadowy fingers to drag me back into that nightmare. Sometimes, when I glance in a mirror, I swear the eyes looking back at me flicker with a darkness that isn't my own, a fleeting glimpse of something ancient and malevolent just beneath the surface. The police never found the host or the source of the cameras, and the Airbnb listing vanished without a trace, erased as if the entire nightmare had been scrubbed from existence, except for the scars left behind, both physical and mental. I'm left with a lingering question that haunts me in every silent moment. Was the camera just a tool, or was it a doorway, a way for something to reach through screens, walls, and time itself to prey on those foolish enough to step inside? Now, every time I book a place to stay, I check twice, triple check, for hidden cameras, because I've learned the hard way that sometimes what's watching you isn't human. And sometimes, once you've been seen, the nightmare never truly ends. The months after that nightmare stretched into a blur of fear and uncertainty, each day bleeding into the next without relief. I found myself jumping at the smallest sounds, obsessively checking locks, scanning rooms for shadows that seemed to move just beyond the corner of my eye. The experience had shattered my sense of safety, and even the most mundane moments felt tainted by a lurking menace. My phone continued to betray me. Strange calls with only static, texts from unknown numbers filled with indecipherable symbols or chilling phrases like, "We never stop watching." One evening, unable to bear the isolation and paranoia any longer, I tried to reach out to the local police again, hoping for answers or reassurance, but the response was always the same. A polite dismissal, a shrug of the shoulders, an unspoken, "There's nothing we can do." It was like the nightmare existed in a shadow realm beyond the reach of law or logic. At times, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I caught fleeting glimpses of movement just outside my peripheral vision, or the sudden chill of breath on my neck when no one was there. Mirrors became instruments of dread. Whenever I caught my reflection, it was subtly wrong, like I was staring at a stranger with hollow eyes. One night, as the clock approached that cursed 3:17 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. When I looked, the screen displayed a live feed from the very camera we had found in the Airbnb, except it was showing my bedroom, my bed, my life. And in the corner of the frame, that blurred figure was there, standing just out of focus, watching. I realized then that the nightmare hadn't ended. It had followed me, anchored itself through the camera's eye, and it was still waiting, patient, eternal, unyielding, until the moment I looked away. After that terrifying night, my life descended into an unrelenting spiral of paranoia and isolation. Every device I owned became suspect. My phone, my laptop, even my smart TV seemed to betray me at every turn. I found myself obsessively scanning every inch of my apartment for hidden cameras or microphones, ripping open walls and tearing apart furniture, desperate to find the source of the malevolent presence that had invaded my life. The blurred figure from the footage haunted my dreams, but even worse, it began to seep into my waking moments, glimpsed fleetingly in reflections, shadows stretching just beyond the corner of my eye, always watching, always waiting. Friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away, convinced that this darkness could infect them too, that speaking about it aloud would only invite it closer. The police investigation went cold, the Airbnb vanished from the listings, and the host disappeared without a trace, as if the entire nightmare had been erased, except for the scars etched deep into my mind and soul. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the clock edged toward that cursed time, 3:17 a.m., I could still feel the cold breath of the cabin's malevolence on my neck, the sense that the watcher was patient, eternal, and waiting for me to falter. I realized that this wasn't just a story about hidden cameras or violated privacy. It was about something ancient and dark using modern technology as a gateway to feed on fear and despair. And no matter how far I run or how tightly I close my eyes, it watches, waiting for the moment I look away, so it can pull me back into the nightmare forever. The days after discovering the hidden cameras in that Airbnb cabin blurred together into a haze of dread and exhaustion. A nightmare that clung to me like a second skin I couldn't shed no matter how hard I tried. The initial shock had given way to a gnawing paranoia that spread into every corner of my life, twisting familiar places into sinister traps and turning everyday objects into potential threats. I became obsessed with technology, the very tools that had been used to violate my privacy and invade my home, poring over every detail in a desperate attempt to understand the magnitude of what had happened. My phone buzzed constantly with cryptic messages and static-filled calls, the silence on the other end more terrifying than any words could be. Every mirror reflected not just my image but the blurred, distorted shape of the watcher lurking just behind me, a spectral presence that grew stronger with each passing day. Nights offered no reprieve. Sleep was a battleground where shadows moved with intent, whispers curled around me like smoke, and the clock's hands crawled toward that cursed hour of 3:17 a.m., when the boundary between this world and whatever darkness inhabited that cabin seemed to thin dangerously. I tried to reach out to the police again and again, but their reassurances felt hollow, their efforts slow and ineffective, as if the case was already cold, buried beneath layers of denial and bureaucracy. The Airbnb listing disappeared as if erased from existence, and the host vanished without a trace, leaving no leads, no answers, just a void filled with silence and suspicion. The footage we'd seen, with its impossible images and shadowy figures, played on repeat in my mind, a never-ending loop of terror that haunted even my waking hours. I realized, with a growing sense of hopelessness, that the cameras were more than just tools of voyeurism. They were gateways, portals that had allowed something ancient and malevolent to reach through screens and walls, tethering itself to me through technology. It wasn't just about watching anymore. It was about possession, control, and feeding on fear. I became a prisoner in my own home, cutting off contact with the outside world, too afraid to trust even my own reflection. The blurred figure from the footage seemed to seep into reality itself, manifesting in fleeting glimpses, a pale face appearing in the corner of my vision, eyes hollow and unblinking. I took to recording my surroundings obsessively, hoping to catch proof of the presence that haunted me, but the recordings only showed fleeting shadows and static, glimpses of a darkness that defied understanding. And then, one night, as I sat alone in the pitch black, the silence shattered with the sound of my phone buzzing violently, displaying a live feed from a camera I hadn't installed. One focused directly on my bed, showing me lying there, vulnerable and alone. In the corner of the screen, just out of focus but unmistakable, stood the blurred figure, watching, waiting. The nightmare wasn't over. It was never over. And it was only a matter of time before the door to that darkness opened again, and it pulled me back inside. The aftermath of that horrifying discovery spiraled into something far beyond what I had anticipated, turning my entire existence into a waking nightmare that I couldn't escape no matter how far I ran or how fiercely I fought. Each morning I woke with a pounding heart and a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, knowing that the shadow of that Airbnb cabin still clung to me like a parasite feeding on my fear. The invasion of privacy wasn't just about the cameras, those tiny, hidden eyes that had watched our most intimate moments. It was about the dark presence that had used them as a gateway into my life, a presence that seemed to grow stronger with every breath I took. Technology, which I had once trusted, became my enemy. My phone buzzed with messages I couldn't decipher, often accompanied by static that morphed into haunting whispers barely audible but unmistakably threatening. Every device in my home felt tainted, alive with a sinister energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I tore apart my apartment looking for more hidden cameras, only to find emptiness, but that only heightened my paranoia. If it wasn't physical, then maybe it was digital, supernatural, something that couldn't be detected by any human means. Mirrors became portals of terror, reflecting not just my own terrified face but flickering with the blurred image of that pale, twisted figure, its eyes empty and accusing, its smile frozen in a grotesque mockery of human emotion. Sleep became a battleground of shadows and whispers. Each night I battled hallucinations and flashes of the cabin's interior, the walls closing in, the bed where I had been watched, and the oppressive feeling of eyes burning into my skin. The hours around 3:17 a.m., once a mere time on a clock, transformed into a cursed ritual, a moment when reality bent and the darkness reached through the veil to brush against me, cold and unrelenting. Friends and family tried to help, but my isolation grew as I pushed them away, unable to share the depth of the terror without risking their disbelief, or worse, their safety. The police offered no answers, their investigation stalling in bureaucratic limbo. The Airbnb listing vanished as if it had never existed, and the host disappeared into the shadows like a ghost, leaving behind only questions and dread. I began to wonder if the cameras themselves were conduits, not just for someone to spy on us, but for an ancient, malevolent force that thrived on our fear and pain. I set up my own cameras, desperate to capture proof, but the footage was maddening. Flickering static, fleeting shadows, and glimpses of that blurred figure lurking just out of frame, its presence undeniable and suffocating. One night, in a moment of fragile courage, I left a camera running pointed at my bed, hoping to catch whatever haunted me in the act. When I reviewed the footage, I saw myself sleeping, vulnerable, exposed, and in the corner, the figure stood silently, watching, its hollow eyes locked on me in a stare that promised endless torment. The nightmare wasn't confined to that cabin anymore. It had followed me home, embedding itself deep inside my mind and soul, an eternal, patient watcher waiting for the moment I faltered, the moment I looked away, so it could pull me back into its dark embrace and claim me forever. In the endless days and restless nights that followed, I became a prisoner of my own mind, trapped in a spiraling abyss where fear and paranoia bled into every waking moment. The presence that had invaded our Airbnb was no longer confined to a remote cabin in the woods. It had taken root inside me, a dark seed growing beneath my skin, twisting my thoughts and warping my perception of reality. I started to distrust everything. Friends, family, even my own reflection in the mirror became an enemy. The blurred figure from the footage haunted the edges of my vision, sometimes a flicker in the corner of my eye, sometimes a looming shadow in the dead of night. It was patient, waiting for me to slip, to lower my guard, and when I did, it reached out with icy fingers to pull me back into the nightmare that had no end. My home, once a sanctuary, turned into a maze of hidden threats. Every nook and cranny seemed to conceal watching eyes. Every whisper in the static on my devices was a taunt, a reminder that I was never truly alone. Technology, the very medium through which this horror had entered my life, became a battleground. My phone's screen flickered with ghostly faces and distorted voices. My laptop's webcam blinked on and off as if controlled by an unseen force, and every attempt to disconnect only tightened the invisible chains that bound me. Sleep became impossible each night. The clock's hands crawled toward 3:17 a.m., the cursed hour when the veil between worlds thinned and the presence could touch me directly. I was haunted by dreams where the cabin's walls closed in around me, the bed where we had slept transformed into a trap, and the blurred figure stood watch, its empty eyes boring into my soul. I sought help from strangers who claimed knowledge of the occult, desperate for a way to break free, but their rituals and prayers were powerless against an evil that transcended human understanding. The police, once a source of hope, became distant voices in the background. Their investigations stalled and fruitless, unable to pierce the veil of darkness that shrouded the case. The Airbnb listing and the host vanished, erased from existence like a bad dream, but the scars remained, etched deep into my mind and body, a constant reminder of what I had endured. I became a ghost in my own life, wandering through days filled with dread and nights filled with terror, endlessly watching screens in the hope of catching a glimpse of the horror, only to see flickering shadows and the ever-present blurred figure lurking just beyond the frame. The camera in the Airbnb was never just a tool for voyeurism. It was a gateway, a conduit for a darkness that feeds on fear, violation, and despair. Now it watches me still, through screens, through shadows, through the cracks in my soul, waiting patiently for the moment I look away so it can pull me back into the nightmare forever. The terror had seeped so deeply into my life that it was impossible to distinguish reality from nightmare anymore. The blurred figure wasn't just an image on a screen. It was a shadow stalking the edges of every moment, lurking in every corner, and creeping into every silence. I started hearing footsteps behind me when no one was there, catching glimpses of movement in reflections where nothing should have been moving, and feeling the cold, heavy presence pressing in on me, crushing my chest with invisible weight. I tried to escape by moving to a new apartment, but the feeling followed me like a curse. Within days, I found another hidden camera, this one crudely taped behind a smoke detector, staring out toward my bedroom. The intrusion was no longer confined to one place. It had spread, infecting my entire world. The calls continued, silent, static-filled, sometimes carrying faint whispers that sent chills crawling down my spine. I stopped answering the phone altogether. Friends stopped visiting. I was alone, truly alone, with the watcher. At night, I would stare at the clock as it edged closer to 3:17 a.m., heart hammering, breath shallow, waiting for the moment when the darkness would press in thickest, when the line between the living world and whatever lurked beyond would blur, and the nightmare would become tangible again. One morning, exhausted and broken, I discovered new footage sent anonymously to my email. A grainy, flickering video showing me asleep in my bed, and in the corner, barely visible but unmistakable, the blurred figure standing silently, watching, waiting. The camera was a doorway, a link that connected me to that cursed cabin and the evil that had taken root inside it. And now, I understood the terrifying truth. No matter how far I ran, no matter how tightly I closed my eyes, the watcher was patient, eternal, and waiting for the moment I looked away so it could pull me back into its dark embrace forever. The weeks that followed the discovery of the new camera became a blur of sleepless nights and frantic paranoia that consumed every corner of my existence. I found myself trapped in a waking nightmare where the boundary between the real and the supernatural dissolved into a constant state of dread. Every shadow seemed alive, every whisper of wind carried a hidden voice, and the walls around me felt less like protection and more like a cage built by unseen forces determined to break me down. I obsessively tore apart my apartment searching for more hidden devices, but the terror wasn't always physical. It seeped into the digital realm, infecting my devices with eerie glitches and disturbing images that flickered across screens when I least expected it. My phone was a tormentor, buzzing relentlessly with calls that ended in silence or whispered threats too faint to decipher, and messages full of static and indecipherable symbols that seemed almost ritualistic. Sleep became an enemy, and dreams twisted into horrific visions of the cabin's interior. The bed, the curtains, the menacing shadow with hollow eyes that always waited in the corner, watching, never blinking. I started to feel the presence physically, a chilling weight on my chest that pressed down as I tried to breathe, a cold hand brushing my skin just before I woke gasping for air. The cursed hour of 3:17 a.m. loomed over me like a dark omen, a time when the veil thinned and the Watcher's power grew strongest. Friends and family who tried to reach me found only silence or fractured, incoherent responses, as I sank deeper into isolation, convinced that speaking aloud about the horror would only give it more power. The police investigation had long since gone cold. The Airbnb listing had vanished, erased like a phantom, and the host was nowhere to be found. All that remained was the endless, haunting footage that replayed in my mind. Scenes of me sleeping, moments of vulnerability, and always the blurred figure standing just out of focus, waiting with a patience that chilled me to my core. I realized that the camera was not just a device for watching, but a portal, a gateway that had allowed something ancient and malevolent to cross into my world, binding itself to me through screens and shadows. It was a force that fed on fear and despair, growing stronger with every moment I spent trapped in its gaze. Now, no matter where I go, I carry the weight of that presence with me, knowing that the eyes that once watched me from behind a hidden lens in an Airbnb cabin now watch me everywhere, waiting, patient, eternal, for the moment I look away, so it can pull me back into the nightmare forever. In the end, I learned the hardest truth of all. Some nightmares don't end because they want you to escape, but because they want you to suffer, trapped in a cycle of fear and helplessness that becomes your new reality. The camera in that Airbnb was never just a device. It was a key, a beacon that opened a door to something dark, something ancient and patient, something that doesn't just watch but waits, feeds, and traps. I tried everything, running, fighting, seeking help, but the darkness followed, clinging to me like a second skin, seeping into every aspect of my life until I could no longer tell where I ended and it began. The police closed the case, the listings vanished, and the host disappeared like a ghost, but I never escaped. The Watcher's eyes are always there, flickering in reflections, lurking in the static on my screens, whispering in the silence when I'm alone. I don't know if I'll ever be free, or if this presence will haunt me until my last breath. But one thing is certain. Once you've been seen, once you've been recorded and watched through a hidden lens, you are never truly alone again. The nightmare waits patiently in the dark, and all it takes is one glance away for it to pull you back in, forever. Story 4. I still remember the exact day I found that journal. It was late fall, when the trees were losing their leaves and the air had a sharp chill that made me pull my jacket tighter around me. I needed to clear my mind, so I headed out into the woods behind my house. A place I'd spent so many afternoons as a kid, a place that used to feel safe. The path was familiar, winding between ancient oaks and maples, their branches like skeletal fingers stretching across the sky. The ground was soft with damp leaves and pine needles. I wandered farther than usual, lost in thought, until I saw something lying near the roots of a giant oak. It was the journal. The leather cover was cracked and worn, but it wasn't old enough to be ancient, and yet it felt wrong. I hesitated before picking it up, an unease creeping in. When I opened it, the first page was blank except for my name, written in a shaky hand. Not just my first name, but my full name, spelled out perfectly in ink that looked freshly applied, as if it had been written moments before. I felt a chill slide down my spine. Flipping through the pages, I realized the journal contained detailed entries of my life, moments only I would know about, the places I'd been, conversations I'd had, memories I hadn't shared with a soul. But the entries didn't stop there. They predicted things that hadn't happened yet, things that would happen in the coming days, weeks, and months. It was impossible, but the journal's pages described my future like a script written for me to follow, sometimes in terrifying detail. At first, I thought someone was playing a sick joke on me, maybe a stalker or someone who knew too much about my life, but the predictions were uncannily accurate. When I read an entry about meeting an old friend unexpectedly at a coffee shop, it happened exactly as described the next day. Another entry told of a minor car accident I was supposed to have, and days later I found myself in the emergency room with a concussion. The journal wasn't just chronicling my life, it was controlling it. With every new day, the entries grew darker. The journal began to warn me about shadowy figures watching me, footsteps following me at night, strange noises outside my window. I dismissed it as paranoia at first, but soon those warnings became reality. I saw glimpses of a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just out of clear view, and heard footsteps in the hall when no one was there. I tried to destroy the journal. I burned the pages, tore them up, buried the remains deep in the forest where I'd found it. But every morning, I woke to find the journal on my doorstep, the pages intact and filled with new writing. The journal was alive in some way, tethered to me, binding me to a fate I was powerless to escape. My life started to unravel. I became obsessed with the journal, reading it over and over, trying to understand how and why it was connected to me. My relationships with friends and family frayed as I withdrew into a world of fear and confusion. The journal wrote of my thoughts, my deepest fears, and even my darkest secrets before I could articulate them. It was as if the book could see inside me. One entry chilled me to my core. It described a moment when I would be trapped, alone, facing a terrible danger. I don't want to say what it was, but it felt so real, so imminent that I started living in constant fear, unable to shake the feeling that the journal was guiding me toward that horrifying event. Desperation drove me to seek help. I reached out to local historians, occult experts, and anyone who might understand the journal's origins. The stories I heard only deepened the mystery. A reclusive writer who vanished decades ago after claiming he had a book that wrote itself, a curse linked to the land, and warnings about a force that devours souls bound by ink and paper. The journal's grip tightened. It didn't just predict, it demanded obedience. Every decision I made felt shadowed by the words on those pages. I tried to resist, but no matter what I did, my actions seemed to align with the journal's narrative. It was like living in a story I couldn't edit, where the author was a dark presence beyond my control. Sleep became a battlefield. Dreams were invaded by the journal's words, the forest, the hidden figure. I awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, feeling the cold breath of something breathing down my neck. Mirrors reflected not just me but flickering images of the cabin, the journal, and that unseen watcher. The clock's hands seemed to mock me as they neared 3:17 a.m., the time often mentioned in the journal as pivotal. A moment when the veil between our world and whatever darkness inhabited the pages grew thin, and the journal's power was at its peak. One night, I returned to the woods, hoping to find answers or destroy the journal once and for all. The forest was eerily silent, the moon casting long shadows that danced between the trees. Near the oak where I'd found the journal, I saw fresh footprints in the mud, too large and too deep to be mine. A cold wind whispered through the branches, carrying a voice I couldn't understand, and a shadow moved just beyond the trees. Watching, I dropped the journal on the forest floor and stepped back, heart pounding. The pages fluttered open on their own, revealing a new entry. My name, the place, the time. It was a warning or an invitation. I couldn't tell which. As I fled the forest, the journal's presence was a weight on my back, a chain I couldn't break. No matter where I went, it followed. Now, the journal continues to fill its pages, chronicling every breath I take, every secret I try to hide, every step toward a fate I'm powerless to change. I keep it locked away, but it whispers from its prison, promising that one day, the story will end. The way it wants, not the way I hoped. If you ever find a journal with your name already written inside, I beg you, don't open it. Because once the story starts, you're no longer the author. You're the character trapped in the pages of a nightmare that never ends. The weeks that followed became something unrecognizable, a blur of repetition and fear where each morning began with the journal in the same place. On my nightstand, spine cracked open to a fresh page I hadn't written, detailing things I had not yet done but inevitably would. It described what I'd wear that day, what I'd say in idle conversations, even the arguments I hadn't yet had. And it wasn't just general predictions, it knew everything. The specific number of steps I'd take down my hallway before stubbing my toe on the corner of my couch. The exact time I'd spill coffee on myself because I'd be too distracted by the scream I'd hear outside. One I'd rush to investigate only to find the street completely empty. It knew my habits better than I did. It anticipated the growing fear in my chest, the moments I questioned my sanity, the breaking point when I'd scream at the blank walls of my apartment as if the journal itself was hiding behind them. I gave up trying to talk to people about it. Those who listened humored me with cautious smiles that didn't reach their eyes. One friend offered to take the journal for a while, just to prove it wasn't supernatural, and I let him. That night, he called me in the middle of a storm, his voice shaky, saying the book had rewritten itself with his name in it. His life, his fears. The next day, he was gone. Not moved away or hiding, just gone. No record of him at work, no active phone line, no trace of his car. His apartment completely emptied like he'd never lived there. The journal returned to my door that evening, with his name scratched out violently on the page, replaced by mine again, as though it had decided he wasn't the right subject after all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the book, its pages fluttering in a wind that didn't exist, waiting to see what it would write next. I wondered if resisting the story was still an option, or if I was merely acting out a part one was never meant to escape. Every time I tried to alter the events on the page, taking a different route, saying something I wasn't supposed to, I'd find that somehow the outcome still matched, like the journal didn't just predict, but corrected reality to fit its script. I started to think maybe it wasn't writing about my life at all. Maybe my life was being written by it, one page at a time, like I was just a puppet whose strings dangled from a hand made of parchment and ink. Sometimes I dream of being buried in books, of thousands of journals just like mine, each with a different name and a different story, stacked to the sky in an endless library where nothing ever ended, only turned to the next page. I woke from those dreams gasping, clutching at the journal beside me as if tearing it apart would free me, even though I knew better now. I knew what it wanted. It wasn't just chronicling my life. It was consuming it, turning it into a tale meant to entertain something else, something not human, something that watched from the void between pages, feeding on every heartbeat, every ounce of fear, every word etched in that cursed ink. I don't know how much time has passed since this all began. Days and nights blur into each other, and calendars mean nothing when your life has been reduced to ink on a page you never asked to be written on. I stopped fighting it a long time ago. There was a moment, I think, when I could have tried harder to resist, to burn the journal and never look back. But somewhere deep down I knew that the moment I found it, the story had already begun and I was no longer the author, just the character marching toward an ending I hadn't written. The journal doesn't just watch anymore. It dictates. I open it in the morning not to see what will happen, but to know what I have to do, what I will say, what thoughts I will think. It's not prediction, it's command. I exist now in service to the narrative, and the worst part is that I feel it hollowing me out, page by page. There's barely anything left inside. The pages are filling faster now, too fast. It's like the story is reaching its final act, and I can feel the ending drawing near, cold and certain. I read the last line this morning. It said, "He closes the journal, knowing what he must do. He walks into the woods, back to the place it began, and he leaves it there for the next name it chooses." And as I sit here now, writing these final thoughts down, I understand. I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. The journal has to move on. It feeds not just on fear, but on fresh stories, new names, unknowing hands flipping it open under dappled forest light. So if you're hearing this, if this story somehow found its way to you, and someday you find yourself deep in the woods, staring down at a weathered journal with your name on the first page, don't open it. Don't touch it. Don't even look at it too long. Just turn around and run. Because the moment you read that first line, you're no longer reading a story. You're living it. And the journal is always, always hungry for more.